Hello, my name is Catherine Tackley and I'm Professor of Music at the University of Liverpool. My main research interest is in jazz, particularly in Britain, and I teach modules on jazz and musical theatre to our undergraduate students. Today, jazz is a genre which is heard all over the world, including a flourishing scene here in Britain. But I want to take you back 100 years to the time when jazz was the latest in a long line of American musical trends to influence the popular music of the UK. So, I want you to imagine that you're living in Britain in 1919. You're of course relieved that the war is over, although the reality of the destruction, both practically and emotionally, is part of your everyday existence. Still, life goes on and you're off to the London Palladium, the capital's leading variety theatre, for a night out. You take your place in the audience and you open your programme. Opening the programme, you can see which acts are on the bill this week. There's the usual characters: the comic, risque singer Whit Cunliffe, the character dancer Sissy Lupino, and the singer and comedian Wilkie Bard. So far, so normal. But after the intermission, here's something new. The original Dixieland jazz band, billed here as the creation of jazz, the sensation of America. Jazz, you'd know that that was a new style from America, although you hadn't actually heard the music yet. And you'd know that because people have been singing songs about jazz for years. So before jazz had really been heard as a music in the UK, lots of ideas about it were circulating quite consistently within the musical theatre environment, representative of the latest trends in American fashions. Across all of these early jazz songs, the underlying musical basis remained generally quite similar to previous ragtime songs. So there might be kind of a stride chordal pattern in the bass or in the left hand, and perhaps a lightly syncopated melody or right hand part if a piano accompaniment. So often there wasn't anything that is particularly jazzy about these songs, but when we start to look into the song lyrics, we can see these key characteristics emerging fairly consistently across this early body of songs. So in this first song, Hey Ho, Jazz It With Me from 1919, we see the idea about jazz being better than ragtime. And ragtime was the previous American musical trend that had come to Britain before jazz. And it's this idea that ragtime was becoming outdated and jazz was the latest thing that would overtake it. In the second song, When I Hear That Jazz Band Play from 1917, this is really typical that a lot of jazz songs at the time that were talking about bands and their characteristics. And this idea, say what you will, you can't keep still while they're playing, links the idea that we're supposed to move to this music. It's about dancing, and it's about that dancing, that impulse to dance being really infectious. And the song Jazz, there at the bottom of the screen, talks about exactly the same message. When you hear that rhythm, just go with them, for when the music's playing, start in swaying. It was the idea that you were bound to want to dance to this great new music. This idea about being compelled to do certain things when you listen to jazz and when you respond to that music can lead to perhaps some problematic tendencies in terms of society, and that's what these songs are pointed to here. This spirit of abandon, throwing yourself away in response to that music, and that excess of emotion that the jazzipated melody might cause in that blue-eyed jazz band, almost making somebody cry, was very, very typical again of the sort of language that was used in connection with jazz in these early songs. So again, placing yourself back in 1919, already before your first encounter with an American jazz band, jazz had a reputation as being rather modern, quite risky, and certainly deeply intriguing. So here you are, back at the Palladium, after the intermission. The curtain rises, and this is what you would see and hear. So what would you, as a member of that 1919 audience, have made of the original Dixieland jazz band? And more generally, how did British people react to jazz in Britain? How would we square these reactions with claims that the ODJB, a group of white men from New Orleans, appropriated the popular music of that city in order to achieve their global success? These are just some of the questions that we consider in contemporary jazz studies. Through our work on jazz history, we tried to understand more about how jazz was performed and how audiences responded to it. Acknowledging the roots of jazz as an African American music, we asked questions about the circulation and development of jazz throughout the world. And there's a bit of disclaimer here also for any ardent British jazz fans out there who will know that the original Dixieland jazz band actually played first at the London Hippodrome just for one night before then moving on to the Palladium. The leading comedian on the bill objected to their presence there, perhaps thinking that they were stealing a bit of his particular thunder. So here's a few documented reactions to the original Dixieland jazz band's appearance back in 1919. As you can see, we've got trombonist Lou Davis, who talks about feeling stirred and exhilarating and the music sounding like nothing on earth. And certainly this was something that a lot of people commented on the time. They understood the instruments, they knew what a clarinet was, a trombone, a trumpet, but they'd certainly never heard them being played like that before. For others, it was just almost too much. It was bewildering. They didn't really know what to make of the music at all, and perhaps ultimately just thought that the whole thing was just a bit of a novelty or even a bit of a joke. Lou Davis again gives us some kind of context for understanding those reactions, talking about the standard dance band of the day, which was a piano, violin, drums and banjos. Banjos had been extremely popular in Britain from before the war right through the war as a basis for the latest fashionable popular dance music. And the original Dixieland jazz band presented really quite a different sound to what had been established in Britain as dance music and as popular music of that time. So, although the original Dixieland jazz band were not technically the first jazz band to appear in Britain, their prominence and consistent claims to be the inventors of jazz did attract a lot of attention at this time. Their sound as an ensemble established them as significantly different to the more familiar groups purveying popular music at this time. In fact, the original Dixieland jazz band personified that image of jazz that was already circulating wildly, as demonstrated by the songs that I put up earlier, and this partially explains the impact that the band had on the British public, who generally speaking had no basis to dispute those claims or not to believe them. As we've seen, the first British encounters with this band took place within the confines and distance of the variety show. They were over there on the stage, the audience was safely ensconced in their seats in the auditorium. But quite soon, this band moved into a very different type of venue. This was the newly constructed and massive Hammersmith Palais. And they began to play for dancing. In this environment, there was a closer relationship with their audience, who became participants in rather than just observers of jazz by engaging with the music through dance. And it was in the dance hall then that jazz began to have quite a revolutionary impact on British popular culture. Developing from this risky and somewhat sexual image of jazz that is evident in song, The link between jazz and dancing was often at the root of objections that were being made against jazz on moral grounds from as early as 1919 by pillars of the establishment. Often, these people had little or no actual experience of the music. For example, Canon Drummond, writing in the Times newspaper in March 1919, condemned jazz as mean, low entertainment, although he admitted he had no personal experience of the art of jazz dancing. The original Dixieland Jazz Band then established jazz in the British mainstream entertainment in two important ways. Firstly, it was novelty, comic entertainment that worked really well within the variety setting alongside other musical turns, comedy acts and dancers. Secondly, it established jazz as music for dancing to, and the development of the large suburban palais de danse, such as the Hammersmith one, but they quickly spread to cities right across the country, as well as the technology for mass mediation, all meant that this latest trend in popular music was even more accessible than ever before. Although the original Dixieland Jazz Band was much imitated by British groups, and we can see this through numerous photographs which depict British groups in similar kind of eccentric poses to the original Dixieland Jazz Band, the Dixieland style didn't really persist in Britain for much longer after the group left and returned to America in the middle of 1920. But yet jazz, as much as an idea as a music, had been fundamentally established within British popular culture. The ODJB's departure left a vacuum to some extent, which couldn't be filled immediately by either native or imported American bands. At this point, it's very important to mention the Southern Syncopated Orchestra. This was a large group of African American musicians who arrived in Britain also in 1919, the same year as the original Dixieland Jazz Band. As you can see from this photograph, the format here was more orchestral, although very much dominated by plucked string instruments, banjos and mandolins and things of that sort. But their repertoire was really wide-ranging, stemming from spirituals right through to classical compositions by composers such as Brahms and Dvorak, but also jazz as well. So a really wide range of all within their overall performance. And in many ways, this group, although much less obviously a jazz group, in fact played a more important part in the jazz education of emerging British jazz musicians. It was a large group, and internal disputes led to it fragmenting really around sort of 1920, and the musicians dispersed to a higher degree. There were also periods of strike where the musicians were inactive, and naturally they began to talk, collaborate, jam with their British counterparts. And this was a very important part of British musicians' education at this time. So we can see some testimony here from an orchestra member who points out that during the strikes of the orchestra, they were able to jam and get together and collaborate and learn from one another in this way. Bertrand de Pestre-Salnave says there that he really began to play true jazz at this time and was in competition with the other musicians, and also had introduced himself to the saxophone. He was originally a flautist. So there was a really significant role that these musicians played in educating others around them. It's significant too that the Southern Syncopated Orchestra prompted a significant early example of European jazz criticism from the Swiss conductor Ernest Ansermet. Ansermet understood the lineage of African American music that was being laid out before him by the Southern Syncopated Orchestra, in which spirituals, ragtime, dances and the blues were all inextricably linked. However, he also recognised that this evolution was set to continue into the future, remarking that Sidney Bechet's improvised solos, and Bechet was to become a famous saxophonist and clarinetist in the years to come. He said that his solos already show the germ of the new style and suggested that this may be the highway along which the whole world will swing tomorrow. A really early usage of the word swing before that was really known as a subgenre of jazz. Certainly, it was a while before the understanding of jazz's African-American roots in Britain really developed, And Anseme's writing, as well as other assessments of the Southern Syncopated Orchestra, did help to establish the idea of jazz as being more than a passing fad. Really, its cultural roots began to be better understood. The Southern Syncopated Orchestra's importance in the history and development of jazz in Britain, though, has been quite widely neglected until quite recently. A lot of this is to do with the fact that they didn't always play music that could be understood as jazz, but also important in their neglect is the fact that they didn't record. Well, they did record, but those recordings are no longer in existence. And so for us as historians, evaluating their performance within the history of jazz is much more complicated and much more difficult. We have to look for other sources of evidence to help us to understand what the group played and how they played it. So, what did jazz mean then to the population of Britain in the early 1920s, 100 years ago? One answer to this is that in the 1920s, jazz provided access to a much desired alternative to the values and traditions of the British establishment that were certainly under scrutiny in the aftermath of the war. We know that jazz provided the ideal soundtrack to this post-war period, especially for the so-called lost generation who had little respect for the traditions and values of their elders that had, in their eyes, led to the war. Dancing to jazz prompted the rejection of long-established etiquette associated with the ballroom and with social dance. The social and sexual freedom of women was epitomised in dance clubs where they could drink, smoke, take drugs, meet men and express their sexuality more overtly through dance and dress. But as the African American roots of jazz were increasingly recognised and understood, the appeal of jazz certainly increased, but so did also its threat to the establishment. Whilst the dissenting voices continued within what we might term the British culture industry, predominantly at that point the BBC, it was becoming clear that jazz couldn't just be ignored, but yet there were standards, both moral and musical, that were felt to have to be upheld. Compromises therefore had to be made, and jazz was adopted in the form of dance music that permeated the BBC's output, including live feeds from leading hotel bands such as the Savoy Orpheans, pictured on the right. The continuation of this, of course, is represented by the inclusion of live bands today on shows like Strictly Come Dancing and other variety or talk show type formats. Today, jazz is most readily understood as African American music, and these roots are of course integral to the identity of the genre. But it's also a music that has the flexibility to relate to, but often actually surpass national boundaries. It's really only quite recently that scholars and critics have begun to develop an understanding of jazz as a global or transnational music, as the first popular music to benefit from technologies of recording and broadcasting to aid its rapid spread across the globe. The political and musical dimensions of this are, for me, why it's such a rich and exciting music to study.